Thank you very much. I try to share my screen. And this is my presentation. Well, a great good morning for everyone in Nitra, and I'm glad to see a couple of familiar faces in the audience. And I would like to thank you for including me in your program. It's a great pleasure to be back in Nitra, even if only in the form of online presentation. But well, someday perhaps we can make it in person as well. I try to get my thing to the right side. Can you see this thing then? Okay, thank you. Now, the title of my presentation is Modern Ireland from Text to Screen, which is part of a venture we did in our college or in university in launching a course in novel reading and film adaptations and how they relate to each other. And this presentation actually has grown out of that. The work it is based on is The Commitments, which was the first novel of Roddy Doyle, published in 1987, and which was turned into a highly successful film by Alan Parker in 1991. And actually, the film has just had its 30th anniversary, which led to that very funny situation that the Late Late Show on Irish television actually had a full evening dedicated to the film, but they didn't invite any of the characters or any of the actors or anybody actually who took part in the production of the movie. In spite of the movie actually receiving 4 BAFTA nominations and actually 4 awards, it was nominated for Oscar as well. It didn't quite make it, but it's kind of a cultic representation of Ireland in a crucial period of time, and this is what I would like to tackle: how eventually the film came about, and how eventually the film, relating to somewhat what Fatima presented not that long ago, as to how eventually the imagination and the visuals eventually relate to each other when it comes down to putting to the screen a film which basically lacks any kind of descriptive element. That is, you have to get an idea as to what the settings would be like and what the characters are like. And compared to that, in the film, you basically have a vast kaleidoscope of all these items and how it eventually got produced. Okay, we live in a visual age. From all around, we are bombarded by tons of images, still as well as moving ones, and we take delight in the fact that images present us with a complete and instantaneous imprint of any scene, and we are in no need of relying on mental efforts to create a visual impression of anything by ourselves. Ever since its invention, there has been a great deal of influence of photography, and even more of film on people's visual conception of stories, as both photography and film offer ready-made and realistic visual complexes to the spectator. Although the intriguing world of drama can provide a long-term precedent with its intricate relations between written text and live performance, it is essentially the advance of film that shifts the act of creation from the setting out of longish and detailed description of scenery to the finding of adequate actual locations. And it likewise shifts the act of reception from a concentrated mental effort of reconstructing the written description in the form of an imagined visual impression to an instant registering of a complete visual tableau that's offered by film. The same applies to character as well, since instead of the temporary requirements of character description in a written medium, there is the instantaneous spatial image of a concrete physical appearance of the visual medium. The modern audience relies on such realistic representation of story elements, and that inevitably has its influence on literature as well, both on how it is written and how it is read. The effects of the advance of visual media on the modern world, especially on its contemporary variety, are manifold. There is an observable break with traditional assumptions for evoking the setting of fictional stories. Writers tend to dispense with the compulsion of accurate, realistic, perhaps even naturalistic portrayal of places, attributing less significance to such elements of fiction and fronting others instead. Portrayal of places, character and experience get more prominence in most cases. As the modern reader is in possession of a vast set of visual memories, having access to photorealistic portrayals of even distant exotic places, the writer is no longer compelled to provide painstakingly accurate details for the reader to evoke certain atmospheres and moods of places. Often a small number of items will suffice to embed the story in a particular place and time, with the expectation that the reader will bring his previous visual experience to the text to construct his vision of the story. This leads to a somewhat paradoxical consequence for the reader. The all-powerful author loosens his grip on the reader. Less details mean less concrete vision, and the reader is required to use more of his imagination in a world in which he increasingly relies on an ever more complex array of visual stimulus for the illusion of reality. The prominence of film increases due to the wider range of sensory stimulus the visual medium can provide. Thus, film gains ground on the expense of the novel, as the audience is more keen to just passively receive the visual universe of film than make an effort to use the resources of their imagination, which in turn is constantly made lighter use of due to the abundant impressions. Yet novelists can, as a result, deliberately exploit the idea that people now have some impression of a great variety of places as a consequence of being exposed to an unprecedentedly broad range of visual stimulus available via television, films, and more recently, the internet. Roddy Doyle's novel, The Commitments, the first volume of the Barrytown trilogy, is set in Ireland in the 1980s, in a period that was a pivotal one in many ways in the history of the country. Ireland became independent in 1922, and the newly established Irish Free State was outlined as a Gaelic-speaking, rural-based, confessedly God-fearing traditionalist society, resting on an outdated and in many ways a false pastoral idea. Now, to indicate what exactly this means, is a quotation by then Prime Minister Eamon de Valera from his St. Patrick Day radio speech presented in 1943. And this sums up actually those expectations that, oh, sorry, that I'm just trying to get myself out of the way, that try to sum up that vision, which was supposed to be the ideal version of Ireland. Let me read this out briefly. The ideal island that we would have, the island that we dreamed of, would be the home of a people who valued material wealth only as a basis for right living, of a people who, satisfied with frugal comfort, devoted their leisure to the things of the spirit, a land whose countryside would be bright with cozy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry, with the romping of sturdy children, the contest of athletic youths, and the laughter of happy maidens, whose firesides would be forums for the wisdom of serene old age. The home, in short, of a people living the life that God desires that man should live. Now, the passage has a couple of interesting elements, and if you carefully read it, you recognize that it's indeed a text that never mentions towns or cities, for example. And it refers to a kind of an ideal that one would associate more with the 19th century than with the period of modernity. The state founding ideology eventually brought increasing isolation and poverty to the country. Its peripheral location in Europe and its self-confessed hostility towards the former colonizing power of Britain would further perpetuate deprivation and underdevelopment. Here you get a couple of pictures of Ireland from about mid-century 1950s, 60s, and it's quite clearly visible that this is definitely not what you would associate with a modern Western European country at the time. Improvement only began from the late 1950s onwards, with a decisive change of political leadership and subsequent economic reforms, as those would prepare the country towards European integration. Ireland joined the European Economic Community in 1973, yet the accession coincided with the economic problems that emerged in the wake of the oil crisis of the decade, and these would result in a lasting state of depression throughout the 1980s. Although the benefits of accession were tangible, so were the problems that arrived with the country's involvement in European integration. The overall process of modernization included, after some time, the penetration of unwanted dimensions as well. So by the 1980s, Ireland was very far from that image that the early state founders envisioned. The Ireland of the 1980s showed the picture of a country increasingly less distinct from the rest of Western Europe, with rising living standards, as well as the emergence of modern housing estate culture, satellite TV, football, international rock music, and which also included the phenomena of unemployment, alcoholism, drug abuse, and visibly deteriorating families. And probably the pictures illustrate this in a nice way. The novel, The Commitments, Roddy Doyle's first novel, is set against this backdrop in the fictitious northside Dublin suburb of Barrytown. Doyle focuses on character and action and provides very little detail on the characters is not outlined in sufficient detail either. The only significant dimension of the characters is their speech, as that is the only aspect that helps the reader to place them in a particular social milieu. And it is by inference rather than description that readers construct their images of the individual figures of the novel. On a broad scale, the novel presents a general assessment of the situation of the working classes in Ireland. And in particular, it deals with the prospects as well as the general stance of the young generation of working class people in Dublin, and more precisely in Northside Dublin. Yet the novel remains rather tight-lipped on actual descriptive items, and instead it relies on familiarity with information from outside of the novel, which may not necessarily be available even to the full circle of local readership in the country, let alone those people who don't have a visual image of Ireland at the time. The action of the novel traces the forming, the rise to some local fame, and the collapse and eventual disintegration of a band gathered from local youngsters, a band dedicated to playing soul music, the music of the people as it is explained by Jimmy Rabbit, the character who provides the focal point of the narration of the novel. The choice of soul music by Jimmy is at once a delineation of the social position of the members, not simply an assertion of the fact that they are a part of the working class, but the act of embracing that position and taking pride in it. As soul music is principally associated with the black working class population of the US, Jimmy offers a tentative parallel which is highly ingenious, although there is little that would indeed be adequate in it. Here, the second quotation on this page is the one. This is how it is written in the novel. The film has a slightly different wording because in that case it's blacks instead of niggers. But the quotation goes as, "The Irish are the niggers of Europe, lads." They nearly gasped. It was so true. And Dubliners are the niggers of Ireland.
Sorry
Cool.
to interrupt. It seems that we only see the PowerPoint presentation, like the application with the first slide still on.
Oops.
And not that what you are clicking.
Oh, sorry. Then
you either have to share the full screen or
okay, sorry.
move across the slides in the presentation. Oh yeah, now we can.
Is that right? Okay, then let me just briefly go back to the picture that I wanted to show. Now, this would have been the Ireland of mid-century before modernization gets in, and this is the 1980s scene. And then this is where I happen to be now. So this quotation at the bottom of the page, I'm sorry for the mishap. I shared the wrong set of things. So the Irish are the niggers of Europe, lads. They nearly gasped, it was so true. And Dubliners are the niggers of Ireland. The coaches have fucking everything. And the Northside Dubliners are the niggers of Dublin. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. Nevertheless, the parallel serves to illustrate a shift in the general allegiances of the young generation, especially when the national dimension is concerned. And this is probably something that the quotation on the top of the page refers to, that they are interested in something else and not so much in being Irish. You want to be different, isn't that it? You want to do something with yourselves, isn't that it? Sort of, said Outspan. You don't want to end up like he nodded his head back, those tosses here, aren't I right? The characters are more interested in everyday and rather down-to-earth concerns than lofty ideologies and their otherwise intangible sense of Irishness. Barrytown, the modern suburb of tower blocks and housing developments, is practically free of the influences of large-scale politics and the church. The distant state-founding ideologies are only tentatively evoked by the simple and frugal conditions of the suburb. Current national sentiments are fairly low-key. The only exception is in the third novel of the trilogy, when the football World Cup is on and Ireland is part of the playing teams. And official religion is most of the time reduced to the frequently employed universal expletive, Jesus. In contrast with the lack of descriptive Now, to get an illustration of what exactly the novel looks like, so this is an excerpt from the text of the novel, and as you see, it's most of the time dialogue, and there are only very few interjections of the narrator. And even those are more like elements of describing how they react and not so much where they are or in what kind of environment we should look at them. And another very significant dimension of the text of the novel is how Doyle eventually incorporates music and an imitation of music into the text. So it's indeed a highly imaginative type of textual rendering of what the musical element of the story could be. Otherwise, it's pretty difficult to imagine how you would include music in a written text in any other format. Now, the film adaptation bearing the same title was directed by Alan Parker and was released in 1991. It gained favorable reception and can be seen as one of the main instruments of creating the island at a particular moment of contemporary history. The film departs from the story of the novel at several points, although the main elements remain unchanged. The differences principally result from the potential of the respective medium and from the fact that the film was shot somewhat later. In fact, the time gap between the publication of the novel and the shooting of the film allows for more complex reflection on the story and its implications, and is therefore capable of directing attention to problems that are present in the novel but are less prominent there, such as unemployment. Moreover, the adaptation of the novel to the screen benefits from the change of the medium, as audiovisual representation gives more space to the element of music, as well as the illustration of the Dublin setting of the story. Music becomes an integral part of the storytelling, and the images of the suburb provide an excellent sense of place. The visual medium cannot dispense with descriptive elements, as pictures immediately make an impression. They characterize even without speech. In addition to the site itself, the technique of shooting, lighting, exposure, and the perspectives applied all contribute to the complex of a strong visual stimulus that comes to form a part of the interpretation of the film. Yet film is in fact a chain of interpretations. The director and his technical team interpret the script, and their interpretation in turn affects that of the audience, since the audience will interpret the director's interpretation in the form of the finished film. This feature is all the more important for the creation of the overall visual set of the film. And in this particular case, the lack of a sufficient descriptive foundation in the novel further emphasizes the role of the filmmaker's contribution. The rather script-like nature of the novel gives considerable freedom to the director to create the visual framework for the story. Although it is inevitably conditioned by the period and the location, it is still the director's vision that creates the definitive visual representation of the story, and through that of Ireland at a particular period. The image of the fictitious working-class suburb of Barrytown, modeled on the actual one of Kilbarrack, is created in the film by finding adequate pictorial representation to what is essentially conveyed by the idiom of the characters of the novel, as Doyle's text does not include descriptive passages that could help visualize the environment. The images of the film are thus not so much a portrayal, but a vision, and the pictorial representation of Barrytown is in fact an aggregate of several different locations of Dublin, altogether 44 different places, and not of one particular suburb of the city. The result is eventually a patchwork composed of row houses, tower blocks, narrow streets of older residential quarters, providing a multi-angle view of the working class environment, which is not fully uniform in terms of its different types of housing, yet it still is, as each intimates a cramped, confined, and claustrophobic environment. Metonymically, this patchwork also mirrors the composition of the band, as it is composed of people of rather different situations, yet all of them are firmly rooted in the working class. The technique of photographing the film also contributes to interiors and low lighting. It is during a night scene that Jimmy introduces the idea of soul music to two prospective members of the soon-to-be formed band. And it is likewise during a night scene that Jimmy gets another perspective on the significance of the band after its frustrating breakup. Exterior scenes are often shown in overcast conditions. Interiors are shown in a way that they look crammed and lacking space in general, and many of these scenes are often deliberately underexposed. Small and clumsy back gardens and the labyrinth-like narrow streets behind them further increase this sense of confinement. The recurring motive of angrily barking dogs reflects some basic types of working class experience, such as anger, oppression, and momentary release from it. The scene of Jimmy's father taking stock of his pigeons kept in the tiny back garden, taking out and caressing some of them and then duly putting them back in their respective cages has a similar effect. In strong contrast with the elements suggesting confinement, music plays a fundamental role in both the novel and its film adaptation, not only as the central story element, but as structural item as well. An important constituent of the story is that the characters want to play music. This may be linked with the general idea of expressing themselves, since music is the par excellence expressive art, the least mimetic form from among the art forms. In addition, the general appeal of popular music to any audience is an important motivation, and one that implies the possibility of making some money as well. Music is made a part of the language and style of the novel. Several passages imitating the construction of songs make the novel highly innovative in terms of its narrative style. It is also a cardinal element of the film, from the wedding band at the beginning through auditioning scenes, then a rehearsal scene, the movement scenes in which the characters are engaged in singing together, the numerous scenes from the gigs of the band. Music is basically everywhere in the film. Yet the inclusion of music in such a prominent proportion is not a self-indulgent element. Music is also the proper indication of freedom in spite of limitations, as it is capable of infinite variety of expression while conforming to its own rules and system. Music can thus be seen as an all-encompassing metaphor for the possibility of these working-class youngsters to assert themselves basically in spite of their environment. In addition, music becomes the means of moulding this rather populous group of diverse individuals into a band. Yet it also carries within itself its own subversive possibility, which eventually leads to the collapse of the band due to the individual aspirations and unresolved tensions among band members. As the novel does not simply supply descriptions of the setting in which the rise and fall of the band is presented, the reader is left to his own devices for constructing the image of the assumed environment. With the film adaptation, however, the visual dimension is generously supplied. The characters acquire recognizable features, and the places receive vivid portrayals that bring the story even more alive. The visual complex of the film can thus exert a backward influence on the reading of the novel, as readers will now likely evoke faces of the actors and actresses giving life to the characters, and the location will be likewise recalled in some of those iconic representations of the genuinely Irish working class quarters that are still rather peculiar in spite of globalizing modern tendencies. The additional items of the film help enriching the reception of the novel. Having seen the film, the reader is likely to supply the extra scenes and motives, even when reading or rereading the text. That is, essentially, the reader will use his imagination to reconstruct the implied environment of the novel or readjust that vision when rereading, even if it is memories of the film that will be relied upon for this work of reconstruction. The film is thus instrumental in shaping the vision of modern Ireland in a particular period of time, a representation that is all the more significant in hindsight, as the 1990s would see the spectacular rise of Tiger period. Couple of stills from the film. I know that stills never do justice to a film because a film is meant to be a flow of images rather than just a bunch of stills. In the novel, you never get anything like the housing conditions of the Rabbit family or of any of the other band members, whether they live in row houses, terraced houses, tower blocks, etc. But the film eventually creates a highly ingenious amalgam of Dublin working classes through these different parts of Dublin collapsed and actually telescoped into one particular imaginary suburb that's called Barrytown. In the film. If you look at these four pictures, then obviously the idea that they are in overcast conditions, underexposed, creates a gloomy image of this whole environment. And what I found personally hilarious is that out of the 4 pictures, you've got 3 on which you find horses. In Dublin, that's the capital city, the metropolis of Ireland. And especially if you look at this, the one in the bottom right-hand corner, the young lad is trying to get the horse into the elevator. That is getting the horse up to one of the higher floors of a building. I don't know what people would actually think about that in other places, but in Ireland. Now, as I said, music is everywhere in the film. The top left-hand picture is the audition scene, which is actually the living room of the Rabbit family, which looks to be fairly small, to be honest. But what is also quite funny is the 2 pictures on the wall. One is a painting of the Pope, John Paul II, and the time, sorry. And above him, there's the portrait of Elvis Presley, the king, 2 cultic figures in the Rabbit household. There, and the other 3 pictures show band members doing certain practice sessions in various different environments. One in the slaughterhouse, and then you get the 3 ladies on the right-hand, the bottom right-hand corner, singing and practicing in front of the washing hung out to dry. Again, a typical Dublin scene once again. And I would also call attention to this lovely caged figure of the Virgin Mary. Just to be on the safe side, she's put into a cage so that nobody is going to steal the statue. The night scenes and the low lighting conditions and the underexposed scenes. You've got 2 of those night scenes here that I mentioned. When Jimmy, the fellow in the black apparel, is talking to his 2 friends who would become members of the band about the significance of soul music and of wanting to do something with themselves. And the bottom picture is after the falling apart of the band, the missed opportunity when Wilson Pickett, the famous musician, comes and promises to jam with the band after the respective concert, and the whole thing falls through because there's a huge row and a huge fallout, quite a deal of physical violence. And eventually the band splits up, so there is nobody to play with, even if they would have such a world famous guest coming to adorn the evening show. And the 3rd picture in the top right hand corner is a back garden shed, basically in Joey the Lips, the old member of the band. It's his mother's house, and once again, it's quite telling that you get a backlight scene, and that means that the exposure is concentrated on the background there, and you can't see the faces of. And you just intimate what might be there in the darkness, and you don't get a clear vision of that. Again, something that now, another favorite scene from the movie, pretty often this is used to advertise the film itself, a band photograph which shows a lot of cheerful faces. You recognize that the ladies are fitted out in elegant black clothing, the gentlemen are fitted out in their monkey suits. All of them have a big smile on their face in there, but the location for the band photo is quite telling, that it's a heap of rubble, either a building that has been pulled down or collapsed by itself. Then you get a couple of buildings in the background that are waiting to be pulled down or to collapse by themselves. And although the photographer is cunningly taking the picture from a low perspective that is looking up towards the band, it also gives you that idea that, well, it's probably the rise to fame, what the picture wants to represent. But at the same time, you get an empty sky behind them. It's not a blue sky with sunlight, etc., but you get an empty, overexposed sky in the background, which suggests that perhaps not everything is that nice and rosy. And sorry, this is the final scene of the film and the final slide of my presentation as well. The film has an element which the novel doesn't have, because in the film, Jimmy Rabbit, the central focal point of the narration, keeps commenting. He has imaginary interview scenes. That is, he pretends to be interviewing himself as if in the radio show or on a TV show. And it begins the film. There are a couple of scenes in which he is sitting in a bath tub, and he's speaking to the shower as a microphone. Then there is a mock interview in his bedroom, which he shares with a couple of younger brothers, etc. And there is the final one in which he is actually, in a very, very funny way, he's standing in front of the mirror. So the idea that he reflects on the experience of the band is also shown in the form of a picture of reflection, which is once again quite telling. And if you see the face, how one side of the face is overexposed, the other side is more or less normal, and that he's turning his back on the camera, then that's quite a telling illustration of the nature of reflection. So this is how eventually the very tight-lipped descriptive part of the novel gets visualized by a director. And eventually the great thing about the novel is that you can read it, and indeed, as the previous presentation had, your imagination creates your visual image. But when you get the film version, then you begin to embellish that idea. And it's probably an interesting idea, and that's something that could be part of a research project as well, to get the idea that how much films eventually influence people's habits of rereading books, or deciding to go for the book version as well, if they get to like what eventually the visual representation of a certain novel was like. And with that, I would like to thank you for your kind attention, and that's it.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
On the movie, and is it, trying to represent an accurate representation of poverty-stricken state of Dubliners and darker visual representations rather than the book?
Okay, now I don't think Doyle had any relation whatsoever with colonialism. That is, this was his first novel, and ever since he has been preoccupied with the working classes and their experience of Ireland. He has got a couple of perspectives on history as well, but he doesn't seem to subscribe to any sort of post-colonialist or any other such orientation in terms of his approach to Ireland. He does not have any of that dimension. Very simply, he has the idea of subverting the state founding ideologies, of essentially concentrating on Ireland since independence, and how exactly those ideas that eventually confined Ireland to that I don't know how many decades of poverty and isolation, etc., and how these eventually bear down on the contemporary population. So he does not seem to show any interest in terms of finding historical reasons beyond that. So his representation of the working classes spans anyway from that very interesting biographical detail that he himself is not a working class person in terms of his origin. He's a middle class person and from a very different part of Dublin. But as a teacher of English and geography, he worked for long years in that Dublin suburb called Kilbarrack, which is actually in no means similar in terms of its architectural elements that as his Barrytown is. But it's actually his interest in these people and the kind of missing voice that these people would have. The working classes were not typically represented in Irish literature, especially not in fiction, for several decades, or if they received any kind of address by authors like Dermot Bolger and some others, it would be more like an idealized picture. So this is Roddy Doyle, eventually somebody with an experience of these people, what they are like, etc., and presenting them as they are. And as for the visual representation, I do believe that there is a deliberate emphasis on these aspects of poverty, of confinement, of the difficulties that these people had to face. So Alan Parker's movie is not simply a fashionable movie in which you have a lot of music. But it's a very accurate representation of that kind of peripheral position that that island had, and the working classes having that peripheral position in that Irish society, which in itself would be rather peripheral. So I do think that the film deliberately created this kind of image of of these places, and they deliberately tried to reconstruct. I wouldn't say what vision the novel provides, because the novel doesn't really provide any particular vision. It relies very much on the of character. So it's more. You would want to give an exact graphic representation of living conditions in Ireland, but it's something more like the colorfulness, the affectionate and deep experience of the working classes, which may not be that elegant and not part of what you would call high culture, but it's pretty human nonetheless. And this is, I think, pretty much enhanced by the visuals of the film. So how eventually you get, well, of course, we know the Irish weather, we know the possibilities of of what that allows for. And the film actually uses this as a background, which probably makes the characters even more prominent, so to say. So that's what I think, at least.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?